Hello, dear listener. Welcome to Stories Mystics Family. You've just stepped into a world where stories are not only heard, but deeply felt. Here, every word holds a secret, every tale is a journey, and every character pulls you into their magical universe. Don't forget to hit subscribe and become a part of our Stories Mystics family, where every night is a new adventure waiting for you. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's journey. Miss Marple's village gossip is her deadliest tool.
In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where every smile hides a secret, a single whisper at a tea party sparks a chain of mysteries that only Miss Marple can unravel. A stolen book, a locked box, a missing heirloom, a hidden will, and a stranger haunting the churchyard. What dark truths lurk beneath the village's cozy charm? Why does the gossip always lead to danger? And how does an elderly spinster's knitting conceal the sharpest mind in town?
Chapter 1. Whispers over the teacups. The late afternoon sun dappled the rose trellis outside Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting lacy shadows across the parlor where a small gathering of villagers sipped tea. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked scones and the murmur of polite conversation, but beneath the surface, an undercurrent of unease rippled through the room. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite armchair with a ball of soft blue wool and knitting needles clicking rhythmically, observed her guests with the keen eye of a naturalist studying rare birds. To the untrained observer, it was a typical village tea party. To Miss Marple, it was a tapestry of secrets, each thread of gossip a clue waiting to be unraveled. The occasion was a modest one, a gathering to welcome the new vicar's wife, Mrs. Eleanor Price, to St. Mary Mead. The room was filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's mother, resplendent in a lavender hat; Miss Weatherby, the spinster with a penchant for melodramatic sighs; Mr. Grayson, the local baker, whose flour-dusted hands fidgeted with his teacup; and young Timothy Black, the vicar's assistant, a nervous lad with a habit of blushing at the slightest attention. The conversation had started innocently enough, drifting from the price of eggs to the upcoming church fete, but it took a sharp turn when Mrs. Price, her voice trembling slightly, mentioned a peculiar sight. "I saw the strangest thing last night," she said, setting her teacup down with a faint clink. "A shadowy figure lurking near the old mill by the river, just standing there, watching the village. It gave me quite a turn." The room stilled. Miss Weatherby gasped, her hand fluttering to her chest. "Good heavens, Mrs. Price! A figure? At the mill? Why, that's where old Mr. Finch drowned years ago. Everyone says it's haunted." "Nonsense," Mr. Grayson scoffed, though his knuckles whitened around his cup. "Probably just a tramp passing through. No need to make a ghost story out of it." Timothy Black, who had been silent, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting to the window. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second, noting the boy's unease. She smiled gently and offered, "Perhaps it was merely a trick of the light, Mrs. Price. The mill is rather eerie at dusk, don't you think?" Mrs. Price nodded, but her fingers twisted the lace of her handkerchief. "Perhaps, but it was so deliberate, as if he was waiting for something." The conversation veered back to safer topics: Mrs. Clement's recipe for lemon drizzle cake, the scandalous price of coal. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to know that gossip, like the wind, carried truths in its whispers. A shadowy figure was no small matter in a village where everyone knew everyone's business, and Timothy's flushed cheeks suggested he knew more than he let on. That evening, as the last guest departed and Miss Marple tidied the tea tray, a breathless knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Sally, the vicar's maid, her apron askew and her eyes wide with panic. "Miss Marple, oh, it's dreadful! The vicar's rare book, his prized first edition of Pilgrim's Progress, it's gone! Stolen right from the study this afternoon." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Stolen, you say? Now that is curious. Was the study locked?" "No, ma'am," Sally said, wringing her hands. "The vicar was out visiting Mrs. Finch, and Mrs. Price was here at your tea party. Timothy was supposed to be minding the vicarage, but he was here too. The window was open, though. Someone could have climbed in." Miss Marple patted Sally's arm. There, my dear. Tell the vicar I'll come by tomorrow to discuss it, and don't touch the study until then." As Sally hurried off, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind weaving a different kind of pattern. A stolen book, a shadowy figure, and a nervous assistant. It was a puzzle, and she suspected the threads of today's tea party held the key. The next morning, St. Mary Mead was ablaze with gossip. At the village shop, Mrs. Lumley, the postmistress, leaned over the counter, her voice a conspiratorial hiss. "They say it's a gang of thieves come from London to rob us blind. First the vicar's book, next it'll be our silver." "Nonsense," said Mr. Grayson, who was buying yeast. "I saw footprints by the mill this morning. Big, heavy boots. No London dandy wears those. It's a local. Mark my words."
Miss Marple, picking up a tin of biscuits, listened without comment. Footprints were interesting, but gossip was more so. She made her way to the vicarage, where the vicar, Mr. Clement, greeted her with a weary sigh. "It's a terrible loss, Miss Marple. That book was a gift from my father, worth a small fortune and irreplaceable." Mrs. Price, hovering nearby, added, "I can't think who'd do such a thing, unless that figure I saw. Could it be connected?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Perhaps. Tell me, Mrs. Price, was anyone else at the vicarage yesterday afternoon besides Timothy?" "No one," Mrs. Price said. "Just Timothy, and he was at your tea party most of the time." "And the window?" Miss Marple asked. "Always open," Mr. Clement admitted. "The study gets stuffy." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room. The study was small, with a heavy oak desk, a bookshelf crammed with theological tomes, and a single window overlooking the garden. The sill bore faint smudges of dirt, but no clear footprints. She bent closer, her sharp eyes catching a tiny scrap of blue thread caught on a splinter. It was the same shade as the scarf Timothy had worn yesterday. "Curious," she murmured, tucking the observation away. Over the next few days, Miss Marple made discreet inquiries, letting the village's gossip mill do much of the work. At the Women's Institute, Miss Weatherby confided that Timothy had been acting odd lately, always scribbling in a notebook he kept hidden. The blacksmith mentioned seeing Timothy near the mill 2 nights ago, looking jumpy as a cat. And Mrs. Lumley, ever eager to share, reported that Timothy had mailed a package to London the day before the theft, a package he'd been oddly secretive about. Miss Marple sipped her tea at the Blue Boar Inn, listening as the landlord recounted a tale of a shady fellow asking about rare books at the market last week. Had a city look about him, fancy coat, slick hair, not our sort. The pieces were falling into place, but Miss Marple needed more. She invited Timothy to her cottage under the pretense of discussing the church flower rota. The young man arrived, his eyes darting nervously, his scarf conspicuously absent. "Timothy," Miss Marple said, offering him a scone. "You must be dreadfully upset about the vicar's book. Such a loss for the parish." "Oh, yes, dreadful. I don't know how it happened." "You were at the vicarage that afternoon, weren't you, before you came to my tea party?" Timothy's face reddened. "Only for a bit. I was, tidying the study." "Tidying? How thoughtful. Though I imagine it's hard to keep track of everything in such a busy household. Tell me, have you ever seen a book like Pilgrim's Progress for sale? In London, perhaps?" Timothy's teacup rattled in its saucer. "London? No, I wouldn't know about that." Miss Marple smiled. "Of course not. But young men do have dreams, don't they? A bit of extra money might help with, a new suit, perhaps, or a ticket somewhere exciting." Timothy's hands shook, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and leaned forward. "Timothy, my dear, I found a thread from your scarf on the vicarage window, and Mrs. Lumley mentioned a package you sent to London. If you've gotten into trouble, it's best to tell me now." The young man's shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands. "I didn't mean to steal it," he whispered. "There was a man in London, a dealer. He said he'd pay £100 for the book. I thought I could replace it before anyone noticed. I just wanted to get away, to start fresh somewhere." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "And the shadowy figure Mrs. Price saw, that was you, wasn't it, meeting this dealer near the mill?" Timothy nodded miserably. "He came to collect the book, but I changed my mind. I couldn't go through with it. I hid the book in the church loft instead." Miss Marple patted his hand. "You've done the right thing by telling me. Now let's fetch that book and return it to the vicar. No need for the village to know." The next day, Miss Marple orchestrated a small gathering at the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the church fete. As the group sipped tea, she accidentally knocked over a teapot, sending a cascade of liquid across the table. Timothy, flustered, leapt to help, and in the chaos, Miss Marple slipped into the church and retrieved the book from the loft. She returned just as the group was mopping up, casually placing the book on the vicar's desk. "Good heavens! My Pilgrim's Progress! Where did it come from?" Mr. Clement exclaimed. "I found it in the church," Miss Marple said smoothly. "Perhaps it was misplaced during cleaning. These things do happen." The vicar was overjoyed, and the villagers' gossip shifted to praise for Miss Marple's lucky find. Timothy, pale but relieved, shot him a grateful glance. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes falling on a small locked box tucked inside the book's hollowed-out pages, a box no one else had noticed. She smiled to herself. The village would talk as it always does, but for now the book was back, and Timothy's secret was safe. The locked box, however, was a new thread in the tapestry, one she would unravel another day.
The village of St. Mary Mead settled back into its quiet rhythm, the theft forgotten amid plans for the fete. But Miss Marple, knitting by her fire, knew that gossip was never truly silent. It was her deadliest tool, sharper than any blade, and it had woven another truth from the whispers over the teacups.
Chapter 2. The Locked Box Riddle. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village as Miss Jane Marple stepped out of her cottage, her straw hat tilted against the damp. The return of the vicar's stolen Pilgrim's Progress had quieted the village's chatter about thieves, but a new thread of gossip had emerged, as persistent as the ivy creeping up the churchyard wall. Tucked inside the hollowed-out pages of the book, Miss Marple had discovered a small, locked box, brass, tarnished, with intricate engravings of roses and thorns.
Its discovery had sparked a firestorm of speculation, and Miss Marple, with her knitting bag slung over her arm, was determined to unravel its secrets using the village's most potent weapon, gossip. The box had been presented to the vicar, Mr. Clement, who declared it a curiosity and locked it in his study safe pending further investigation. But St. Mary Mead was not a place where curiosities remained private. By midday, the village shop was abuzz with theories. Mrs. Lumley, the postmistress, whispered that the box was cursed, mark my words, citing a tale of a similar relic found in a haunted manor. Mr. Grayson, the baker, scoffed, insisting it held old coins or some such nonsense. Young Sally, the vicarage maid, swore she'd heard it rattle like bones clattering inside. Miss Marple, selecting a skein of wool from the shop's meagre display, listened without comment, her mind cataloguing each tidbit like stitches in a pattern. At the vicarage, Miss Marple found Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, in a state of nervous agitation. "It's unsettling, Miss Marple," she confided, twisting a pearl brooch on her blouse. "That box turning up in the book, it feels like a message. And after that shadowy figure I saw by the mill, I can't sleep for worrying." Miss Marple patted her hand. There, my dear. Gossip does exaggerate things. Let's see the box, shall we? Perhaps it's less mysterious than the village thinks." Mr. Clement, eager to quell the rumors, agreed to show her the box. It was heavier than it looked, its lock stubborn and unyielding. The engraving suggested age, perhaps a century or more, and a faint scratch on the lid bore the initials E.H. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. E.H. could only be Edward Harrow, the village's retired solicitor, a man of impeccable reputation who lived in a tidy cottage by the green. Why would his initials grace a box hidden in a stolen book? That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to her old friend Dolly Bantry, whose manor overlooked the village. Over tea and cucumber sandwiches, Dolly leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Jane, the whole village is talking about that box. They say it's got love letters or jewels or, what was it, a map to buried treasure? But I heard something odd from my gardener. He saw Mr. Harrow pacing by the church at midnight last week, muttering to himself. Most unlike him, don't you think?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Most unlike him, indeed. Edward Harrow is not a man given to midnight strolls. Did your gardener hear anything specific?" "Only that Mr. Harrow mentioned debts and promises," Dolly said. "Sounds frightfully dramatic, doesn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the postman's tale, overheard at the shop, of a stranger mailing coded letters from the village post-box. Coded letters, a locked box, and Edward Harrow's odd behavior. There was a thread here, and she intended to pull it. The village hall was chosen as the site for opening the box, a decision Mr. Clement made to put an end to this nonsense. The event, scheduled for Friday evening, drew a crowd. Villagers packed the pews, their whispers buzzing like bees. Miss Marple sat near the back, her knitting a quiet companion as she observed the faces around her. Mr. Harrow was there, his silver hair neatly combed, but his hands twisting a handkerchief. Timothy Black, the vicar's assistant, hovered near the door, his eyes darting nervously. Mrs. Price clutched her husband's arm, and Miss Weatherby, ever theatrical, fanned herself with a lace handkerchief. Mr. Clement, with the local blacksmith's help, pried open the box, its hinges groaning in protest. The crowd leaned forward as he lifted the lid, revealing a stack of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon. Gasps rippled through the hall.
Mr. Clement, his face pale, read the topmost letter aloud, a love letter, passionate and desperate, addressed to "My dearest Edward," and signed Lillian. The initials E.H. were unmistakable, and the date, 1895, pointed to a scandal from Edward Harrow's youth. The village erupted in murmurs. "Edward Harrow! In a love affair!" Miss Weatherby exclaimed. "And with Lillian Marsh, that actress who ran off to London. I remember my mother talking about her." Mr. Harrow stood, his face ashen. "This is a private matter," he said, his voice trembling. "I beg you, put those letters away." But the damage was done. By morning, St. Mary Mead was alight with gossip, each villager embellishing the tale. Some said Lillian had died of a broken heart. Others claimed she'd blackmailed Mr. Harrow for years. Miss Marple, sipping tea at the Blue Boar Inn, overheard a new piece of the puzzle from the landlord's wife. "I saw Mr. Harrow on the telephone last night, arguing with someone. Sounded like he was pleading. Said something about no more payments."
Payments. Miss Marple's needles paused. Blackmail was an ugly word, but it fit the pattern. The coded letters, Mr. Harrow's agitation, the box hidden in a stolen book. Someone was using those letters to squeeze money from a man who valued his reputation above all else. Miss Marple decided to visit Mr. Harrow, bringing a jar of her homemade gooseberry jam as an excuse. His cottage was a model of order, with polished furniture and law books lining the shelves. But Mr. Harrow himself was a shadow of his usual self, his eyes red-rimmed and his hands unsteady as he poured tea. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I suppose you've heard the talk. Those letters, they're from a time I'd rather forget. Lillian was a mistake, a youthful folly, but I never thought they'd surface like this." Miss Marple tilted her head. "It's curious, don't you think, that they were hidden in the vicar's book? Almost as if someone wanted them found. Have you had any unusual demands lately?" Mr. Harrow's cup rattled in its saucer. "Demands? I don't know what you mean." But his eyes betrayed him, flickering to a locked drawer in his desk. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Edward, my dear, I've lived in St. Mary Mead a long time. People talk, and I listen. If someone is troubling you, it's better to tell me than let it fester." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's Clara Finch. She was Lillian's maid years ago. She found the letters after Lillian died and has been demanding money ever since. She moved to St. Mary Mead last year, said she'd expose me if I didn't pay. When the book was stolen, I thought she'd orchestrated it to get the box." Miss Marple nodded. Clara Finch, a sour-faced woman who lived in a rented room above the tailor shop. She was rarely seen in the village, but her sharp tongue was well known. The postman's story of coded letters now made sense. Clara covering her tracks. To catch a blackmailer, Miss Marple knew, required cunning. She enlisted Dolly Bantry's help, knowing her friend's flair for drama would be useful. At the next Women's Institute meeting, Miss Marple accidentally let slip a rumor that a second box of letters had been found, containing even more scandalous secrets about E.H. She watched Clara Finch, seated in the corner, stiffen at the news. Dolly, playing her part, added, "They say the vicar's planning to read them publicly at the church tomorrow." That evening, Miss Marple positioned herself in the vicarage garden, hidden behind a rhododendron bush. Sure enough, Clara crept toward the study window with a crowbar in hand, intent on stealing the non-existent second box. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Miss Finch, I think you've misunderstood. There is no second box. But there are plenty of witnesses to your intentions." Clara froze, her face twisting in fury. "You meddling old woman, you have no proof." "Oh, but I do," Miss Marple said, gesturing to Dolly and Mr. Clement, who emerged from the shadows.
And the letters in the first box will be quite enough for the magistrate, especially with your coded demands mailed from the village post box." Defeated, Clara confessed, her voice bitter. She kept the letters for decades, using them to extort Mr. Harrow whenever money ran low. The book theft had been a ploy to retrieve the box before it exposed her, but Timothy's last-minute change of heart had foiled her plan. The next day, Miss Marple ensured the letters were returned to Mr. Harrow, who burned them in his fireplace, his relief palpable. The village, unaware of Clara's role, attributed the box's discovery to Miss Marple's cleverness, and the gossip turned to admiration. Clara left St. Mary Mead quietly, her rent unpaid, her reputation in tatters. As Miss Marple sat in her parlor, knitting a scarf for the church bazaar, she reflected on the power of whispers. The locked box had been a riddle, but the village's chatter had provided the key. Yet, as she tied off a stitch, a new rumor reached her ears. Something about a missing sapphire brooch at the Bantry Manor. Miss Marple smiled. St. Mary Mead was never dull for long.
Chapter 3. The Heirloom's Hidden Trail. The autumn leaves swirled across the lawns of St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and crimson as Miss Jane Marple strolled toward the Bantry Manor. The air carried a crisp bite, but the village was ablaze with a new scandal that warmed every tongue. The disappearance of a sapphire brooch, a cherished heirloom of Colonel Bantry's family, from the manor's drawing room. The theft had ignited a storm of gossip, and Miss Marple, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side, knew that the whispers of St. Mary Mead held the key to unraveling this latest mystery. The locked box affair had barely faded from memory, but a fresh puzzle demanded her attention, and she was ready to weave the village's chatter into a net to catch the thief. The brooch, a star-shaped gem set in filigreed silver, had vanished during a dinner party at the manor, attended by a dozen villagers. Suspicion quickly fell on Eliza May, a new maid with a city accent and a nervous habit of twisting her apron. At the village shop, Mrs. Lumley, the postmistress, clucked her tongue. "Mark my words, that girl's from London, and you know what they're like there, light-fingered. I saw her eyeing the silverware at the church bazaar." Mr. Grayson, the baker, shook his head as he stacked loaves. "It's not always the obvious one, Mrs. Lumley. I heard the Colonel's nephew Rupert was at that dinner. He's been short of cash lately. Gambling debts, they say." Miss Marple, selecting a jar of honey, listened silently, her mind sifting through the gossip like flour through a sieve. Eliza's nervousness was no proof of guilt, but Rupert's debts were a thread worth following. She recalled a snippet from the Women's Institute. The milkman had overheard Rupert arguing with his uncle about money, his voice sharp with desperation. The brooch, worth a small fortune, could tempt a man in need. At the manor, Miss Marple found Dolly Bantry in a state of indignation, her cheeks flushed as she paced the drawing-room. "Jane, it's outrageous. That brooch was my mother-in-law's, passed down for generations, and now it's gone, right under our noses. The Colonel's beside himself." Miss Marple settled into a chintz armchair, her needles clicking softly. "Tell me, Dolly, who was at the dinner party, and where was the brooch kept?" Dolly gestured to a velvet-lined case on the mantel, now empty. "It was right there, on display. We had the usual crowd, Mr. Hallow, Mrs. Price, the vicar, Miss Weatherby, Rupert, and a few others. Eliza was serving, of course. The Colonel thinks she took it when she cleared the plates." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, noting the tall windows overlooking the garden. Were the windows open that evening? Dolly frowned. "Yes, it was warm, but surely no one climbed in. The guests were here the whole time." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But I'd like to speak with Eliza, if I may." Eliza was summoned, her hands trembling as she stood before them. She was a slight girl, barely 20, with wide eyes and a pallor that spoke of sleepless nights.
"I didn't take it, ma'am," she said, her voice quavering. "I swear I didn't. I've never stolen a thing in my life." Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but piercing. "Of course, my dear, but you must have seen something that night. Did anyone linger near the mantel?" Eliza hesitated, then whispered, "Mr. Rupert was there, ma'am, after dinner, when the others were in the garden. He was touching the case, like he was studying it." Dolly's face gaunt. She gasped, "Rupert, my own nephew, Jane! That's absurd!" Miss Marple's needles didn't falter. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Dolly. Eliza, you've been very helpful. Why don't you fetch us some tea?" As Eliza scurried off, Miss Marple turned to her friend. "Dolly, has Rupert been in any trouble lately? Financial, perhaps?" Dolly's face clouded. "Well, he's always been a bit wild. The Colonel's bailed him out of debts before, cards, horses, that sort of thing. But stealing? I can't believe it." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information. Gossip was a mirror, reflecting truths in distorted shapes. She needed more reflections to see the whole picture. The next day, Miss Marple joined the Women's Institute sewing circle, where the brooch was the sole topic of conversation. Miss Weatherby, stitching a lopsided quilt, declared, "It's that maid, I tell you. She's got shifty eyes. My cousin had a maid like that in Bath, stole a pearl necklace and ran off to Bristol." Mrs. Price, arranging flowers for the church, demurred. "I don't know, Miss Weatherby. Eliza seems frightened, not guilty. But I did see Rupert leave the dining room early that night. He said he needed air, but he was gone a good while." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. She turned to the gardener's wife, Mrs. Hodge, who hemmed a tablecloth. "Mrs. Hodge, your husband tends the manor grounds, doesn't he? Has he noticed anything unusual lately?" Mrs. Hodge's needle paused. "Well, now you mention it, he did say he saw something glinting in the hedge by the drawing-room window day after the dinner. Thought it was a bit of glass, but it was gone when he looked again." A glint in the hedge. Miss Marple's mind turned to the open windows and Rupert's absence. Had he hidden the brooch, planning to retrieve it later? She thanked Mrs. Hodge and made a mental note to inspect the manor grounds herself. That afternoon, Miss Marple strolled to the manor, ostensibly to return a borrowed book. The garden was a riot of late roses, but her eyes were on the hedge, a dense row of yew that bordered the drawing-room. She bent low, her fingers brushing the earth, and found a small patch of disturbed soil as if something had been buried and then dug up. Nearby, a single silver filigree leaf, unmistakably from the brooch's setting, lay caught in the foliage.
"Curious," she murmured, tucking the leaf into her handkerchief. "The brooch had been here briefly, but was gone now. Rupert or someone else had acted quickly." To test her suspicions, Miss Marple decided to set a trap. She enlisted the help of young Tommy, the milkman's son, a bright lad with a knack for eavesdropping. "Tommy," she said, pressing a shilling into his hand, "I want you to spread a little story at the village shop. Say you overheard the Colonel talking about finding the brooch near the old oak by the manor gate. Can you do that?" Tommy grinned. "Easy, Miss Marple. I'll have the whole village talking by supper." By evening, the rumor had spread like wildfire. At the Blue Boar Inn, Miss Marple sipped a glass of sherry, listening as the landlord recounted the tale. "They say the brooch is hidden by the oak tree. The Colonel's planning to dig it up tomorrow." Miss Marple watched the door, her knitting a quiet disguise. Sure enough, as the clock struck 9, Rupert Bantry slipped out of the inn, his coat collar turned up against the chill. She followed at a distance, her steps silent on the grass, and saw him head straight for the manor gate. Under the gnarled oak he began to dig, his movements frantic. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm. "Rupert, my dear, I'm afraid the brooch isn't there,
but you've saved me a great deal of trouble by confirming my suspicions." Rupert froze, a clod of earth falling from his hands. "Miss Marple, I was just looking for something I lost." "Of course," she said, her eyes twinkling, "but perhaps you lost it in the hedge first. I found a piece of the brooch in the hedge, you see, and Mrs. Hodge's husband saw it glinting the day after the dinner." Rupert's face crumpled. "I didn't mean to keep it," he muttered. "I was desperate, debts piling up, creditors hounding me. I thought I could sell the brooch and pay them off, but I panicked and hid it in the hedge. Then I went back for it, but it was gone." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "Gone? That's most interesting. Where did you hide it exactly?" "In a hollow under the yew, wrapped in my handkerchief. I checked the next day, but it wasn't there." Miss Marple's mind raced. Someone else had found the brooch, a second thief or an opportunist. She patted Rupert's arm. "Go home, Rupert. Tell your uncle the truth. He's a kind man. He'll help you with your debts, but leave the brooch to me." The next morning, Miss Marple visited Eliza at the manor, finding her polishing silver in the pantry. Her eyes were red from crying, the weight of suspicion heavy on her shoulders. "Eliza," Miss Marple said gently, "you've been very brave, but I need you to think carefully. Did you see anyone near the hedge the day after the dinner party?" Eliza bit her lip. I saw Mr. Grayson, the baker, walking by the hedge. He was carrying a sack of flour, but he stopped and poked around in the bushes. I thought he was looking for weeds or something." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. Mr. Grayson, who had dismissed the gossip about Eliza so quickly, who had been at the dinner party, who had access to the manor grounds. She thanked Eliza and made her way to the bakery, where the air was thick with the scent of fresh bread. Mr. Grayson greeted her with a flowery smile. "Miss Marple, come for a loaf, have you?" "Not today," she said, her tone light. "I was wondering about that sack of flour you were carrying by the manor hedge, the day after the dinner party, wasn't it?" His smile faltered. "Sack? Oh, just delivering to the manor. Nothing unusual." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But it's odd, don't you think, that a sapphire brooch was hidden in that hedge and then vanished? Almost as if someone saw Rupert hide it and took it for themselves." Mr. Grayson's hand stilled on the counter. "I don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "I found a piece of the brooch's setting in the hedge, Mr. Grayson, and Eliza saw you there. If I ask the colonel to search your shop, will we find it?" The baker's face drained of color. After a long silence, he reached under the counter and pulled out a small bundle, unwrapping it to reveal the sapphire brooch, its gems catching the light. "I saw Rupert hide it. I thought I'd keep it safe, maybe sell it later. I didn't mean any harm." Miss Marple took the brooch, her expression unreadable. "You'll explain this to the colonel, Mr. Grayson, and I suggest you start being honest. The village talks, you know." That evening the brooch was returned to the manor, and Eliza was exonerated, her relief palpable. Rupert confessed his debts to the colonel, who, though stern, promised to help him. Mr. Grayson, chastened, offered a public apology at the church, and the villagers' gossip turned to praise for Miss Marple's uncanny knack for solving mysteries. As she sat in her cottage, knitting by the fire, Miss Marple opened the brooch's velvet case to find a folded note tucked inside, its ink faded but legible. "The will is hidden where the roses bloom." She smiled. The village's whispers had solved one puzzle, but another was already blooming, ready for her to pluck.
Chapter 4. The Will in the Shadows. The late September sun cast long shadows over St. Mary Mead, gilding the village green as Miss Jane Marple stepped lightly along the path to the church. The sapphire brooch mystery had been neatly resolved, but a new thread of intrigue had emerged from its velvet case. A cryptic note reading, "The will is hidden where the roses bloom." The words had set the village ablaze with speculation, each whispered theory more fanciful than the last. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, knew that the truth lay not in the wild tales of buried treasure, but in the quiet murmurs of the village. Gossip, her sharpest tool, would unravel this riddle of a hidden will. The note pointed to a will tied to the Bantry Manor, home of Colonel and Dolly Bantry, and the village was quick to weave stories around it. At the post office, Mrs. Lumley, her spectacles glinting, declared, "It's old Sir Henry Bantry's will, I'll wager. They say he hid it to cut out his weewood son." The butcher, slicing mutton, countered, "Nonsense! It's a fortune for a secret heir hidden in the manor's rose garden." Miss Marple, collecting a parcel, listened with her usual calm, noting the undercurrent of unease beneath the chatter. A will meant inheritance, and inheritance meant motive. Someone in St. Mary Mead was guarding a secret. Miss Marple visited the manor, where Dolly Bantry greeted her with a flustered wave. "Jane, this will business is driving me mad. The village won't stop talking, and the colonel's worried it'll stir up trouble." "A will! As if we haven't enough to deal with after that brooch fiasco." Miss Marple settled into a wing-back chair, her needles clicking softly. "Tell me, Dolly, has anyone shown unusual interest in the manor lately, perhaps asking about old records or the rose garden?" Dolly frowned, pouring tea. "Well, now you mention it, Clara Bantry, the colonel's cousin, has been poking around. She visited last week asking for family papers, said she's writing a memoir, but she was awfully keen on the attic, where we keep old documents." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Clara Bantry, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, had arrived in St. Mary Mead a month ago, renting a cottage near the river. She was a distant relative, rarely seen at the manor, but her sudden interest in family history was intriguing. "And the rose garden?" Miss Marple asked. "Any visitors there?" Dolly shook her head. "Not that I've seen, but the gardener mentioned someone trampled the rose beds near the attic window. Thought it was rabbits, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to a snippet of gossip from the Women's Institute. The seamstress, Miss Carter, had mentioned Clara borrowing a ladder to fix a curtain at her cottage. A ladder, trampled roses, and an attic. Pieces of a puzzle were forming, but they needed stitching together. That evening, the village fete brought St. Mary Mead to life with stalls of homemade jams, knitted scarves, and a raucous coconut shy. Miss Marple, stationed at the tea stall, poured cups of Earl Grey while listening to the crowd's chatter. Miss Weatherby, her hat askew, was regaling a group with tales of hidden wills and secret fortunes, while the librarian, Mr. Tate, mentioned a curious detail. Clara had spent hours in the village archives requesting manor records from Sir Henry's time. She was quite insistent and took notes in a little red book. As Miss Marple handed a cup to Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, she asked, "Mrs. Price, you live near Clara's cottage, don't you? Have you noticed anything unusual?" Mrs. Price hesitated, then leaned closer. "Well, I shouldn't say, but I saw Clara burning papers in her garden last night. Looked like letters or documents. There was a dreadful smell." Miss Marple's needles paused in her mind. Burning papers suggested something to hide, and Clara's interest in the manor's attic was no coincidence. The note's mention of roses could point to the rose garden, or perhaps the attic, where a rose-patterned wallpaper adorned the walls. She needed to see that attic for herself. The next morning, a fire broke out in the manor's attic, sending plumes of smoke over St. Mary Mead. The village fire brigade, a ragtag group of volunteers, doused the flames, but not before the attic's contents, boxes of old letters, ledgers, and furniture, were reduced to ash. Only a singed document, clutched by the colonel, survived, a fragment of a will, naming Clara as a minor beneficiary, but leaving the bulk of the estate to a distant nephew, Arthur Bantry, long thought dead. The village buzzed with accusations. At the Blue Boar Inn, the landlord muttered, "That Clara's behind it, I reckon. She's been sniffing around the manor like a fox in a henhouse." Mrs. Lumley agreed, adding, "She was seen near the manor before the fire, carrying a lantern, no less." Miss Marple, sipping tea at the vicarage, considered the evidence. Clara stood to lose if Arthur's claim was confirmed, but arson was a bold move for a woman known for her caution. She recalled a conversation at the fete. The milkman had seen Clara arguing with a stranger near the manor gate, a man with a city suit and a briefcase. Was Clara working alone, or was someone else pulling the strings? Miss Marple visited the manor to inspect the attic, now a charred ruin smelling of soot and damp wood. The rose-patterned wallpaper was blackened, but a corner near the window revealed a hidden panel, its edges scorched but intact. She pressed it gently, and it sprang open, revealing a small cavity, empty. If the will had been hidden here, someone had reached it first. "Dolly," Miss Marple said, turning to her friend, "who has access to the attic? Besides the family, I mean." Dolly wrung her hands. "Only the staff, and they're rarely up here. But Clara was here last week looking at old trunks. She said it was for her memoir, but she was awfully keen on the attic." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the window, where the rose garden lay below. Trampled beds, a ladder, a fire, the pieces were aligning, but she needed proof. Clara's burning of papers suggested she'd found something, perhaps the will itself, and the fire was a desperate attempt to destroy evidence.
To catch her quarry, Miss Marple devised a plan as delicate as her lacework. She enlisted Mr. Tate, the librarian, to spread a rumor at the village shop. The colonel had found a second will, hidden in the manor's library, confirming Arthur Bantry as the true heir. "It's to be read at the church hall tomorrow," Mr. Tate said loudly, ensuring Clara, buying thread nearby, overheard. That night, Miss Marple positioned herself in the manor's library, hidden behind a heavy curtain. The room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight, and the shelves loomed like silent sentinels. At midnight, a faint creak announced an intruder. Clara Bantry slipped inside, a flashlight in hand, her face taut with determination. She rifled through books, muttering, "It must be here. I won't lose everything." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but cutting. "Clara, my dear, there is no second will, but your presence here is quite revealing." Clara gasped, dropping her flashlight. "Miss Marple, I was just looking for a book." "For a memoir, perhaps? Or for a will you thought you'd destroyed in the attic fire?" "I found the hidden panel, Clara, and Mrs. Price saw you burning papers. The will you found named Arthur Bantry, didn't it?" Clara's face twisted, her voice low. "You don't understand. I've lived in the shadow of this family all my life, scraps of their wealth, their name. When I found the will in the attic, I knew it would ruin me. Arthur's alive, living in London, and he'd take everything. I had to act." Miss Marple nodded. "So you set the fire to destroy it. But you kept a copy, didn't you? Burning papers in your garden to cover your tracks?" Clara's shoulders slumped. "I didn't mean it to go this far. I just wanted what's mine." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. You'll tell the colonel the truth, Clara, and we'll find Arthur. The village talks, you know, and secrets don't stay hidden long. The next day, a village meeting was called at the church hall, ostensibly to discuss the fate's proceeds. Miss Marple, with Dolly's help, had prepared a fake will, a convincing forgery, penned in her neat hand, naming Arthur as heir. As the colonel read it aloud, Clara, seated in the front row, turned pale. Before he finished, she stood, her voice trembling. "Stop! It's true! I found the real will! I burned it in the attic to keep my share. Arthur's alive, and I couldn't let him take it all." The crowd gasped, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "Clara has made a mistake, but she's owned it. Colonel, I believe the original will's fragment, saved from the fire, is enough to locate Arthur." The colonel, stern but fair, nodded. "We'll find him, and Clara, you'll face the consequences." Clara left the hall in silence, her head bowed. The village, stunned, turned its gossip to Arthur Bantry, speculating about his return. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, smiled. The will was safe, and justice was served. But as she left the hall, a new whisper reached her ears. A stranger had been seen watching the church at dusk, a figure that stirred old memories of St. Mary Mead's past.
Chapter 5. The Churchyard Secret. The autumn dusk settled over St. Mary Mead like a velvet curtain, softening the edges of the village's thatched roofs and casting long shadows across the churchyard. The ancient yews stood sentinel, their gnarled branches whispering secrets to the wind. The church of St. Mary the Virgin, with its weathered stones and ivy-clad tower, was the heart of the village's history, its graves a silent archive of loves and losses. But tonight it was a stage for unease, stirred by tales of a stranger who haunted the Lychgate at twilight, his silhouette as elusive as mist. In the Blue Boar, where lamplight flickered over oak beams, the villagers wove their theories with the gusto of weavers at a loom. Old Mr. Hargreaves, his pipe sending curls of smoke heavenward, swore the stranger was a ghost, doomed to wander for some forgotten sin. "Seen him myself, I have," he rasped. "Tall and gaunt, with eyes like a man who stared into the abyss." The barmaid, Jenny, scoffed, but shivered as she recounted young Billy Potter's tale of spotting the figure muttering to a gravestone, a notebook clutched in his hand. "Treasure hunter, more like," chimed the butcher, slicing the air with his pint. "Betty's after them Roman coins they say's buried under the church." Miss Jane Marple, of course, did not frequent the pub's smoky embrace. Her domain was the quieter corners of St. Mary Mead, the church porch, the tea shop, the garden gate where neighbors lingered. But gossip, that nimble-footed messenger, reached her as surely as the morning post. It arrived on Sunday, wrapped in the solemnity of the vicar's sermon and the rustle of hymnals. Miss Marple sat in her pew, her knitting bag a soft weight beside her, her eyes tracing the familiar faces of the congregation. The vicar spoke of redemption, but the air hummed with something less celestial, a collective unease, glances darting toward the stained glass windows, as if the stranger might peer through. After the service, Miss Marple lingered in the church porch, her scarf a shield against the October chill. The sexton, Mr. Griggs, approached her, his boots leaving faint traces of earth on the flagstones. A man of weathered hands and few words, he had tended the churchyard since before the war, each grave as familiar to him as a friend. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, twisting his cap. "Queer goings-on, ain't there? That stranger's been at it again, pokin' round the soldiers' row, dug up the soil by Captain Hargrave's stone. Small patches, like he's testin' the ground. Thought it was rabbits, till I saw the marks. Precise they were, like a man with a purpose." Miss Jane Marple's needles paused, her gaze sharpening. "Captain Hargrave, you say?" The
The soldier lost in the Great War? Aye, Edward Hargrave. Never came home, though his widow, God rest her, swore he'd turn up one day. Empty grave, that one, save for a name and a prayer. The stranger's taken a shine to it, seen him there thrice now, kneeling like he's mourning a brother. She nodded, her mind already threading the needle. Edward Hargrave was a name etched in village memory, a hero whose tale had faded into legend. His widow, Eleanor, had been a frail figure, her days spent knitting for soldiers and her nights waiting for a letter that never arrived. The grave, unmarked save for lichen and sorrow, stood as a testament to hope unfulfilled. And now this stranger, stirring the earth like a man seeking absolution. Her next clue came unexpectedly, borne on a breeze of chrysanthemums. Miss Marple was adjusting her hat by the church gate when Miss Lavender, the florist, bustled up, her arms full of blooms for the altar. Her cheeks were flushed from the hill, her eyes bright with news. "Oh, Miss Marple, just the person!" she exclaimed, pressing a posy of cream roses into her hands. "A gift for your parlor. But have you heard about the bouquets? Every Friday without fail, someone leaves lilies and forget-me-nots on the church steps. No note, no name, just left there to wilt. I've seen the stranger myself, you know, from my shop window. Tall in a faded mackintosh, sketching the churchyard like an artist mapping a canvas." "Lilies for remembrance," Miss Marple mused, her voice soft as the rose's petals. "And forget-me-nots for loyalty. A curious choice. And you say he sketches?" "Like his life depends on it," Miss Lavender said, lowering her voice. "I caught a glimpse once, lines and crosses, like he's charting the graves. Gives me the shivers, it does, with all this talk of ghosts." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind weaving the florist's words into the growing tapestry. A stranger sketching graves, disturbing soil, leaving flowers. The village saw a ghost or a thief, but Miss Marple saw a man tethered to the past, his actions a cipher for something deeper. Her chance came at the village harvest supper, held in the church hall, under garlands of wheat and apples. The room glowed with candlelight, the air rich with the scent of cider and roasted chestnuts. Miss Marple sat at a corner table, her knitting a quiet companion as she listened to the hum of voices. The children, flushed from games, darted between tables, and it was little Mary Potter, her pigtails bouncing, who brought the next clue. "Miss Marple, I saw him," Mary whispered, her eyes wide as saucers. "The stranger by the church wall, drawing in his book. I hid behind the yew and watched. He was copying the names on the stones, but he stopped at Captain Hargrave's. He touched it, like it was precious."
Did he now? Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but her mind raced. And what did he look like, Mary? Tall, with sad eyes. His coat was all patches, but his shoes were shiny, like a gentleman's. He dropped something, a little metal thing, glinting in the grass. "I didn't touch it, promise." Miss Marple patted her hand, her thoughts turning to the glinting object. A button, a coin, or something more. A soldier's badge, perhaps, lost in haste. She resolved to visit the churchyard herself under the guise of laying flowers for the harvest festival. The next dawn found her there, her scarf wrapped tight against the morning's bite. The churchyard was still, save for the chatter of sparrows and the crunch of gravel under her sensible shoes. She paused by Captain Hargrove's grave, its stone weathered to near illegibility, the lichen a green veil over the past. The soil nearby was indeed disturbed, not by careless digging, but with precision, as if someone had probed for something specific. Kneeling, she sifted the earth and found it, a small, tarnished metal, half buried, its ribbon frayed but intact. A military cross, awarded for gallantry, its surface etched with faint initials, E.H. Miss Marple's heart quickened.
The medal was no accident, no relic of carelessness. It was a clue, left or lost by a man whose purpose was tied to Hargrove's name. She pocketed carefully, her plan forming like a pattern in her knitting. That evening, she sent a message through Tommy Tuttle, the baker's boy, to the stranger. A simple note, folded neatly. "Meet me at the churchyard at dusk. I have found what you seek." She signed it only with her initials, trusting the village grapevine to carry it to its mark. Dusk fell, painting the sky in hues of amber and indigo. Miss Marple stood by the lich-gate, her silhouette small but resolute. The stranger appeared as if summoned by the shadows, his mackintosh flapping in the breeze. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with a face carved by grief and time. His eyes, though, held a spark of hope, like a man who had wandered long and glimpsed home. "You're Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, tinged with a city accent softened by weariness. "You have it?" She held out the metal, its tarnish catching the last light. "This, I believe, is yours, or your father's." He froze, his hand trembling as he took it. "How did you know?" "The village talks," she said, simply, her smile gentle but unyielding. "You are Edward Hargrove's son, are you not? Come to honor a father you never knew?" He nodded, his throat working. "James Hargrove. My mother raised me alone in London, told me stories of him. A captain, brave and kind, lost at Ypres. She died last year, left me his letters, and this." He pulled a second medal from his pocket, a twin to the one she held. "She said he buried his military cross here, under his stone, to keep it safe. I came to find it, to prove he existed. The army records are a mess. Some say he deserted, others that he died a hero. I need the truth." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. The bouquets, the sketches, the disturbed earth, all to find this. But why not ask openly? "Shame," he admitted, his voice breaking. "If he was a deserter, I couldn't bear the village knowing. They loved him here, and I wanted to give him back his honor." She led him to the grave, where the soil yielded easily under her trowel. There, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small tin containing papers. A letter from Edward to Eleanor, confessing he'd been captured, not killed, and had hidden the metal to protect his men's legacy. The truth was clear. No deserter, but a hero who had sacrificed his freedom. Miss Marple arranged a quiet gathering at the church the next day, where James read his father's letter aloud. The villagers, their gossip now turned to pride, wept and clapped, raising funds to restore the grave with a proper inscription. The medals were placed in the village hall, a testament to Captain Hargrove's courage. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple sat in her pew, her knitting needles clicking softly, her heart warmed by the village's unity. The churchyard was quiet once more, its secrets laid to rest. St. Mary Mead basked in peace, and Miss Marple, with a twinkle in her eye, knew the gossip had woven its final, truthful thread.